Fair enough. I just take that back. I'll say that in front of the camera. I'm very sorry for it. I didn't welcome anyone before. That's very impolite from my side.
Thank you everyone for coming to our lectures program. Now we will have a conversation. It's too loud? It's too... closer. No, I don't need to bend the camera, that's okay. The conversation with Kiana Hayeri about her project Promises Written on the Ice Left in the Sun. He'll be mediated by Bertan Selim from VID Foundation. I will give you the word.
So thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here, and thank you very much for the organization for having us here for the Krajn Photo Fest. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Bertan Selim. I'm the founder and the director of the VID Foundation for Photography that supports emerging photographers from the Balkans. And I have the pleasure here today to speak with Kiana Hayeri. Can you hear me like that? Or is it closer is better? Oh, okay, thank you. Yes, yeah, I can hear it now as well. And we're here to talk about your work, which has been titled Promises Written on the Ice Left in the Sun. And the way that we'll do it now is that I'll give the floor to Kiana, that will have, you have a presentation that you've prepared. That'll take about 30 minutes. Right after the presentation, we'll open it immediately up for questions to see if there's any immediate reaction. And then Kiana and I will go into a conversation, and then it will be more of an interactive session. So please feel free to ask your questions as we also ask the questions. Kiana already had a presentation today about your book. And I know that you already had your opening 2 days ago in Ljubljana at the Galeria Fotografia. And yeah, so it's been a lot of information. Today's going to be slightly different because what we're going to talk about as well, we decided is going to be more focusing on your practice and how you're doing this, like the project work and project-based work, and also you as the person who you are, how do you bring that into the work, etc. So we wanted to also give a different dimension to also the presentation in itself. I think before I give it over, I think Kiana and I were talking this morning, we're curious, how many of you knew of Kiana's work before you came here? Okay, well that's interesting because I think you get a very sort of multi-dimensional sort of approach, except for the people that might know it, but hopefully also for you guys, there will be a more of an in-depth experience to Kiana's work. Kiana, I'll give it over to you now.
Thank you. This is good news. I was a little bit nervous having had the opening and going through that. So this is, the title is Promises Written on the Ice Left in the Sun. It's actually kind of we're going through the journey I did from a young photographer to here and how stories branched out into what they became. Little background, I'm Iranian Canadian. I was born in Iran. And I moved to Canada when I was a teenager. And I really picked up photography in the absence of language skills. When I was in Canada, I couldn't speak English, so I started taking all the classes, art classes in my school, plus English. And photography felt very right because I didn't have to speak. So I started doing well, I started making friends, I started camera became this thing that connected me to this environment that I didn't belong to. And I think that theme carries on throughout my career. I use the camera to immerse myself into spaces that I don't belong to. And one of the very first thing I photograph, and I usually tell young people that you don't need to go far away to tell stories. On one trip back to Iran, I organically started photographing my own friends, which was this is around 2010. And these are some of the first images at that time coming out of Iran that was portraying the progressive and modern youth. And I was just very organically photographing my own friends. I brought the work back to the West, to Canada and to US, and got a lot of good feedback. And I think one of the things that this taught me is to photograph things that are tangible, sensible for people. Youth exists everywhere in the world. And people were able to connect to this land, Iran, that was very far away, and in media it was portrayed in a certain way through those photographs. Then later I went back and I expanded that body of work and photographed other young people in Iran and became a large body of work. That's how I landed in Afghanistan for the first time. I got an assignment to go to Kabul and photograph the dating scene in Kabul, which was very exciting at the time. This is in 2014, right after the election. And through that story, I got to experience this young generation, mostly in Kabul and some of the bigger cities like Herat, who were very much like us in so many ways. So I decided to move and expand that body of work and photograph this generation that at that time in 2014-15 were very hopeful about the future. They thought they have agency, they can change their future, they can make decisions. Nevertheless, about a year later, half of them were gone, a few of them were killed, and that group of people disappeared. I learned, as I said, a very important lesson about photographing things that are sensible. So I lived in a house. I had one of my housemates was an Australian producer working for an Afghan channel, creating this series called Shireen about a single mother who was working in a courthouse, starting from cleaning and working her way up to become an assistant. And one day he came home with a script, because he wrote it in English, and he had it translated into Dari. By the way, I speak Dari, the language spoken in Afghanistan. So he asked me to go through the script and make sure the translation was good. And as I was going through the translation, I started noticing that there's no word for single mother. Single mothers are determined by the status of their husbands, being divorcee or widowed. And that was fascinating for me. I mean, there were at that time more than 1 million single mothers raising their kids by themselves, and yet there is no term for it, neither in Dari or Pashto. So I decided, as simple as that, I'm gonna photograph single mothers of Afghanistan. So this is, by the way, behind the scene of that set, Shireen. So I went on this journey for Harper's Magazine to kind of embed myself into people's homes and photograph normal life of single mothers and how it was. And I think because I was able to speak the language, because I could blend in, and this is at a time, just to put things into context, the insecurity was a concern on a daily basis, kidnapping and attacks. So I was able to go by myself, stay in these homes for days at a time, and hang out and have the time to produce this body of work. I also learned in prisons there are women who raise their children by themselves. So I made an attempt and I went to Herat city and got access to the prison for about 2 hours, and I photograph women who were raising their children in prison. While I was doing interview for this story, and this is in 2016, there was a woman, and I'm so sorry, I think if you attended the opening, I told this story, so I apologize for repeating it, but there was a moment where I was interviewing a group of women, somebody that I wasn't interviewing, who was sitting in the back of the room. I was asking them about their fears. After they leave the prison, do they fear anything? And this woman yelled at me and saying, you know, I killed my husband, I've lost my children, I've lost my life, what else do I have to lose? I don't have anything to fear. That really stayed with me. Fast forward 2 years later, and a trigger warning, next photo is a bit graphic. 2 years later, I was working on a story about mental health in Afghanistan, and I visited the burn ward, where some women had attempted suicide by setting themselves on fire. And I met a girl named Samira. Samira at that time was 17. She was 16 when she was married off, and in the year she lived in her in-laws, she went through horrendous life, tortured in every way possible, physically, verbally, emotionally, sexually. She had aborted one child because she was starved to death. And she had given birth to a baby who was 7 or 8 months at that time, and yet she set herself on fire to free herself. And it was around that time that I kind of started questioning, what does it take for a woman to kill herself, to free herself and liberate herself from this abuse, and what does it take for them to kill their husbands. So I proposed to the New York Times magazine, and I went back to Herat prison to work with women who had killed their husbands to get out of abuse and domestic violence. And to this day, this project remains one of the most surprising stories that I worked on, where I think all of us, no matter how hard we try, we go into stories with some ideas of what this could be. And in that prison, everything that I thought would be the story was shattered. And it really became the story really became about this space called a prison, that women felt more free in it and happier than outside. And as I was sending photos, I stayed in the prison for about 15 days, including one sleepover. And as I was sending photos back to my editors, they kept giving me feedback that, we need to see this as a prison. And I was like, well, this is a prison. This is how a prison looks like here. The story went on. It was published about a year later. And shortly after the story was published, COVID hit. One of the women was released, and I went on to collaborate and create an audiobook and then something else. And on the day, so Kabul was the last city that fell, Herat was the second last. Before, and again, sorry if you guys, I'm so sorry, there's some overlap stories. If you were at the talk today, I've told this story, that the prison, the day before Taliban marched into Herat city, the prison guards opened the door and let all the women out, no questions asked. And in my head, it was not liberating for a lot of these women. They were just put into this bigger prison called Afghanistan. Which is the core of we're going to move through the next section very fast because we talked about the book, but if you have any questions, whoever wasn't there, we can happily come back. But it became the core idea behind this book that it was published this year, When Cages Fly. The name comes, actually we didn't talk about this, the name comes from a quote from an Italian philosopher who says, if you try to cage a free spirit behind the bar, you'll find that even cages can fly. And I think that it was just that idea was it was brilliant. And the book has 3 chapters. The first and last chapters are outside of the prison. One before Taliban takeover. The last chapter is after Taliban takes over. And the middle chapter is the prison, and it's inside a case. And I invite the viewer as they go through this, they have to rip through the book. They have to destroy that chapter in order to get access to it. And this is one of my favorite quotes, and I'm going to ask for your help because I have a hard time pronouncing her name. A Nigerian writer. One more time. Chimamanda, where she says the consequence of a single story or a single narrative is that it robs people from dignity. And I think subconsciously that always existed in my way of storytelling, but after reading that and after studying her work, that became more dominant. And these are some of briefly we're going to go through them, these are some of my favorite stories that I worked on in Afghanistan, which was very different. This was a story about, at that time when we did this story, there were 16 swimming pools in Kabul, 2 of them allowed women. We got access to the swimming pool to do reporting there, and we met this woman, Fatima, who, even though she can't really swim because there was no proper swimming instructor, she would go swimming because the sound of the stroke and the water would allow her to separate herself from the chaos and the suicide attack outside. We did a story about a Sufi, like a mystic Sufi, who was a poet and an admirer of Rumi, who had his own Sufi circle in the corner of the National Library in Kabul for over 25 years. And we told the story of Afghanistan through his eyes. Governments came, they collapsed, they left, war started just outside of, there was a suicide attack outside of his window where his window shattered, but he stayed there. 25 years, twice a week, people would come and they would read poetry. Eventually, unfortunately, due to COVID, when COVID hit that summer, he died. And I'm honored, truly honored that this photo became an icon of him. We looked into the a lot of the changes and the progress happened in the past 20 years by reporting on women who entered armed forces. And what was interesting is, as much as on the outside they wanted to, journalists, media wanted to show that there has been progress and women are joining armed forces, but when you go deep into, especially into conservative societies like host the East and the South, women are not accepted. They're actually seen as bad women and judged by their own community. And we also told the story of this mother who was so supportive that she went on the first day of her daughter going to work, Second Lieutenant Zala. She went with her for a week so she can settle into her post. And this is when they were saying goodbye. I'm gonna have goosebumps here. So this story was just a few months before Taliban took over. At that time, many parts of Afghanistan was controlled by the Taliban. And we went to do, and many of them, girls were banned from going to school. Education was already banned. And we went to find families who had moved from their villages and districts into the city just to be able to educate their daughters. And now, in like looking back 3 years later, I kind of see it. I mean, it was foreshadowing what was coming. We just never knew Taliban were actually going to take over the country. And one of the very special stories that I worked on was when the negotiation between Americans and the Taliban was happening, there was a week of reduction in violence. So as part of the prerequisite to this deal being signed was that for a week, the violence had to almost stop. So we were able to, me and my colleague Mujib Mash'al, New York Times bureau chief, we were able to travel to places where we couldn't. So we went to Zabul, to this one outpost on the highway. And this is an outpost that they would get ambushed all the time, every day, and we were able to visit them. And it was very interesting because for a day we sat down with them, and Mujib, who, I mean, he's Afghan himself, he could communicate with them in Pashto, would challenge them about what does peace look like to you. And none of them could, they didn't have an understanding of what peace meant. And at some point I remember Mujib kind of challenged them and told, these are all young people. They're all barely like 20, 21, 22. And meaning that none of them saw the world saw what Afghanistan looked like before American took over, American invaded. And told one of the guys, there were two brothers, and said, you know, if peace happens, it means next year when we come back, there's a Talib sitting next to you and we're all sharing the same food from the same plate. And kind of hit them that they never imagined what peace would look like because they had never seen it. Beginning of 2021, I did a story about my editor at National Geographic reached out to me and said, we want to do a story about Afghanistan. Basically, what do you want to do? And it was amazing. It felt great. So I wanted to look into this divide that existed between, the divide that existed between the rural area and the urban population. Because in the 20 years that foreign forces were present in Afghanistan, a lot of the aids went to the cities and the urban population. So the progress happened there. Meanwhile, the rural population, they stayed behind, they got distance. And I think that's really the core of what has happened in Afghanistan since then. I do like this because this is how, when I have big projects, I love mind maps. Do you guys know what mind maps are? You basically create a visual representation of your thoughts. And I basically, sorry for using this word, I vomited everything onto a paper and I started like making sense of it. It's like, okay, this is an example, this is that. And I do that almost with every big project that I do. And so I went on to look at this divide through a couple of different channels. One of it naturally was young people. Sombol, at that time she was 17, she was 17. She went to ANIM, Afghanistan National Institute of Music, which was a school, it was a music school, and the only music school. Sombol comes from a very conservative region that was controlled by the Taliban for a long time. Her father was kidnapped by the Taliban several times, being forced to take his daughters out of music school, which he refused to. She went on to become a violin player, excellent violin player. The day Taliban took over, Anim school was attacked, and many instruments were destroyed. Even I think last week or 2 weeks ago, the Vice and Virtue, they also announced they burnt another 120 instruments in Afghanistan. This is ongoing. And so Songo and her uncle, they were among that population that were outside of the airport. I assume a lot of you guys have seen those photos of people desperately trying to leave. On August 24th or 5th, there was a suicide attack that happened right outside of the airport. Songbol was there. She did survive, but her dream of performing in Afghanistan, I would say it was shattered, like many people who died around her. I also went to a JRC, Juvenile Rehabilitation Center, which is basically prison for people under 18. And I met with a group of teenagers, 2 of them, and one of them, he was a political prisoner. It's a loose term for people who help the Taliban or Daesh. This was really heartbreaking because I was challenging him to kind of like dream and see himself in 10 years from that time. And he was unable to, like, no matter how hard I tried, like, so how do you see yourself? Like, how do you see yourself outside of the prison? He was just like unable to dream. Little background about him, he had 2 brothers that one joined the Taliban, he was 20, and then the other brother who was 18, he joined the Afghan army. The one who was 20 was killed. So he followed his path and joined the Taliban. When I eventually gave him examples of, I said, listen, I don't know, I'm 30, and when I'm 40, I don't know, I want to have a big house, I want to have like a family, I want this and that. I eventually was like, so how do you see yourself? He kind of shrugged and said, I don't know, I'll probably be dead. And that says a lot about this generation that was unable to dream because they were brought up in so much disability, instability. That's the word I wanted to say. I also continued telling the stories from both the cities, looking at all the progress that was made in the in that 20 years, and also in rural areas, things that was not changed. I also looked into some very rare rural population who were open-minded and progressive by nature. So even though aid and foreign influence never reached there, they were believers in sending their students, their kids, their daughters into school. I visited frontline. I was obsessed at that time. I was obsessed with the idea that there were fractions within families. There were cousins fighting cousins. They were brothers fighting brothers. So I visited Karsai Peak, which was this one village, and then there was the peak, and that was the front line. Cousins were fighting cousins. Eventually that front line, a month before Taliban took over, I don't know why this is going forward, it's not supposed to go, but anyway, all these young men were killed after Taliban basically overran Karsai Peak. And this is the legacy of Americans, bringing young people into the fight, and then they were all dead. Hafiza, she is 4 of her sons took very different directions. One of them joined the Taliban. One of them, so the top guy joined the Taliban. The second one on the left, he joined a militia fighting the Taliban. The one on the right, he joined special forces, and the bottom joined the army. So everyone took a different route. And when I was interviewing her, her son, the one who was part of the militia, removed the scarf and showed this open wound on her throat, saying that doctors say it's caused by grief. When we were like putting the piece together with the team at Nat Geo, somebody had this idea that this wound is basically a symbol for Afghanistan, that is struggling. It's a country with open wounds that it's struggling to heal. Beginning of the end. That summer, it was very chaotic. There were attacks every day. Districts were falling very fast, to the point that at New York Times Bureau, we had one man dedicated to counting the fallen men, and another colleague who was dedicated to count fallen districts. And it moved all very, very fast, to the point that when the fall happened, when Taliban walked into the city, those of us who were inside the country, we didn't see it coming. On the day Taliban came, I went to the airport to photograph people who were desperately trying to leave because they knew Taliban was coming in. At 4 a.m. I left the house. By 11, I had photographed a plane, which now we know it was the last commercial flight that took off from Kabul. And we went to, I learned that the banks, people are gathering in front of banks demanding for the money come out, so that's usually always bad news. I went there and it was in front of this bank that I learned Taliban had walked into the city from the west of the city, from Company Road. And it was unbelievable. So I went home. By the time I reached home, I got a call from New York Times that you have 20 minutes to pack and go to the airport. This was the last frame I photographed, like the last frame of my camera before I left. And where you see the wall at the very, very end, that's the start of the green zone. What's interesting, the green zone, which was a safe haven for all the embassies, all the big NGOs, UN, it's now all Taliban. It's all the big Talibs have moved in there. And it's quite a scene because the New York Times bureau is inside that compound, so it's quite a scene. Hafiza ended up on the cover of Nat Geo at the end of that year. She did become the symbol of Afghanistan. So when the 1-year anniversary came up, I proposed to my editors that we go do a follow-up story to find out what happened between these brothers who went different direction. I am not going to tell you exactly what happened. This was actually Bertan's idea to put a QR code if you guys want to go read the story, because it's the reason I don't tell you the story. It's really funny and these guys have got a great sense of humor to deal with such a fragmented family. So we went and we spent a few days with Hafiza, and you guys let me know when I can go forward. I know, that worked. I will go ahead. So we spent a few days with Hafiza and her family in the house. Those are 3 of the brothers, who were including the taller brother who's on the further left. The middle one is the special forces. The one on the right is the militia brother. So I also took a copy of the magazine for Hafiza, and I'm going to let you watch this. I'll translate as it happens, and I'll tell you something.
حفیظه جان، عکسی که من از شما گرفتم روی جلد ای مجله چاپ شد.
Hafiza John, the photo that I took of you ended up on the cover of this magazine. I brought you a copy, and I want you to see it. She leans over to her grandson and is like, "Is this me?" Everybody laughs, says, "Yes, yes."
این برای شماست، برای شما آوردم.
This is for you. I brought this for you. That interaction of her bringing the magazine so close and examining it, looking at it, asking, "Is this me?" That stayed with me. And as you can see, I can become obsessed about certain scenes, and like I will. 4 hours driving back to the city, I keep thinking about this incident. I was like, "What happened?" And then I remembered I've been to this house many, many, many times, and I've never seen a mirror in the house. So I called the grandson and I said, "Do you guys have a mirror in the house?" He said no. So that's the first time Hafiza saw herself on a cover of Nat Geo in a long time. I don't know how long, but and this is not the last project I worked on, but I think it's a good conclusion of where Afghanistan arrived. I'm not going to talk a lot about it. I'm going to let you guys read the text. But for New York Times, about a year and a half after Taliban took over, they asked me to go and look at basically lives of women and tell the story. So we did this massive portrait project where I spoke to 96 women across Afghanistan from all walks of life to understand how their lives have changed after a year and a half. And I talked to wives of Talib, mothers of Talib, to women who worked in ministries and had jobs or people whose lives didn't change. So me and my 2 local colleagues, Yaqub and Safi, we basically sat down and again like vomited our thoughts and things that we wanted to cover on our whiteboard. And I came back the next morning. Safi found out my brain was too chaotic, so he kind of organized my thoughts, which I appreciated. And I'm just gonna let this run. You guys enjoy it. Maybe I do comment about a few of the stories. Keshvar, her son was executed in a genocide that happened by the Taliban in the first regime. And she, I kind of wanted to know how she feels that the same people who killed her son are back. Maimuna is the wife of a big commander, Taliban commander. And as you can see, 8 of her family members were killed in a drone strike. Simina and Morsa, mother and daughter, her husband was a famous pilot who killed many Talibs and eventually was killed by the Taliban. And Marjan was the last female working journalist in Herat, who quit not long after I took her photo. Like 2 weeks later, she was out of the scene. Finished. Half an hour. Pretty good.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for that, Kiana. It's a lot to take in. I think it's a lot of information, but it's very impressive to see everything, sort of also you sharing your peace of mind in terms of also working process, but also your thinking and also your own sort of tribulations, perhaps challenges in you having done all the work. And so thank you so much for sharing it and for the openness and the sincerity in which you share that with us. I have a whole bunch of questions, but I'm going to sort of open up and see whether there's any immediate reactions to what you saw now. And if not, then I'm going to continue immediately. Is there anything anybody wants to ask at this stage?
I will. Oh, wow, yes. Yes, we were interviewing a therapist in Kabul who was at that time talking about how Americans and foreigners came. They made all these promises that they will do things for women, and they basically, this is the exact wording she used. She said these were promises that was written on the ice and left in the sun, and that's and in Farsi it's even more poetic when you say it in Farsi. That was many years before this body of work came together. When we were editing, I actually edited this, the Loba, the exhibition I edited with Sarah Lean, who's an editor, who was an editor at the National Geographic. She was the director of photography, actually. And she asked me, what is the story you want to tell? And I said, I think it's a story of what was gained in regards to women's rights in Afghanistan and what is lost. And that title was just very well suited for the body of work. Tell us.
I can talk loudly too.
No, they need to get on camera.
Oh, so this is like, in many ways, it kind of follows the arc of your career, and yet it has become this big, broad, nuanced body of work. And I'm wondering at what point you sort of realized that you wanted to put it all together to tell this story about women in Afghanistan.
I think after Taliban took over, access changed. And I saw many things I want to photograph, I can't, mostly because I would put people in danger. And that's when for the first time, and also after a year after Taliban took over, I left Afghanistan. So I stayed under the Taliban for 1 year. I think for the first time when I left, I had a moment to think, I had a moment to reflect on my own work. And this continues till now. Right now I'm editing another set of, like a body of work out of my years of archive. And that's, I had a breathing moment that I could go back and look into it, and it overlapped with at the same time with the Leica Loba portfolio. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Any other ones before we continue?
Come on. Okay.
Not that shy. Can you say something about how can we have the other mic, by the way, because then it's going to be easier to sort of shuffle. Thank you. Could you say something about how, because I understand that some of the work that you've done has been commissioned, so that the theme comes from above, as it were. How do you find topics that you're interested in? What's your process of sort of delving into the context? How do you, I mean, we saw this really intricate mind map that you make. The question is, when does that mind map happen? And just walk us through that thinking.
I started as going back to when I started as a photography. I worked odd jobs like anybody else, but I was like passionate about the stories I was telling. So I learned to like tell the stories I want. And slowly I learned, you can apply for grants. And so I would do my own work. And I think by a certain age, I had I think I developed my own voice. Then I started getting commissioned for my own voice. Oh, you do work about young people? Go to Afghanistan, tell the story about dating scene. So that's, and then naturally I did a lot of stories on women. And then by doing the work that I did, I think I built up enough trust where when people needed stories, like, do you have something to pitch? And that's when I would use that opportunity to something that I was obsessed with and I was interested in. So like pitch it as like the prison story. It was a story I wanted to tell. Literally, New York Times wrote to me, the magazine, is like, do you have a story? I was like, yes, actually, can we do this? And they're like, okay, go do it. And even to this day, there are things I'm developing this very large-scale story about education under attack around the world. The first part of it is being pulled out of my work in Afghanistan. The second part of it, I'm shooting it out of pocket, hoping that I can approach grants or publication and say, hey, I would like to do this and this and this and this to be able to do what I want to do.
Can you say something about, because I know that also there's a lot of photographers that obviously attend festivals like this and they're curious to also understand your experience. Can you say something about the level of responsibility that perhaps is always present in the background when you are working in a very painful context and when you're trying to represent people, issues, certain themes that might come across as being exotic on the other side, especially in a context when it's displaced out of the sort of the natural context, as it were?
Very good question. I think having lived in Afghanistan for so long, it gave me the position to be able to argue with editors when I have been commissioned on stories where I pushed back and I said, this is wrong, this is not the true story, and this is not the right way of saying it. And I also have been, so the topics is one thing, is portrayal of the society is one thing. I remember, not going to name the publication, I did a big story for a publication and they wanted to a double spread, and they were pushing, is like, we need a photo with a woman in burqa to run it as a double page. And I was like, no, why? Like, it doesn't mean everyone in Afghanistan wear burqa. So, and I think that responsibility falls on the photographer. And in order to fulfill that, you have to either live in the place or go back and be knowledgeable about to be able to lay out your argument. If you're a parachuter, you can't argue against those things. So I think it goes hand in hand. Does that answer?
And perhaps to sort of to go on to that, I mean, just to dwell on that point a little bit, to what extent do you think that you also as a photographer perhaps have the responsibility to sort of quote unquote educate perhaps editors that sit very comfortably perhaps somewhere very far away from the context where you're in, and sometimes it's banal and probably sometimes it's a very sort of heated argument, like how do you even maneuver that?
It's a big responsibility and everybody has to do it because your editor, no matter how amazing they are, they're sitting in their office in, I don't know, New York or DC. They don't know what's on the ground. I think what's important is, as a person, you know what you know and you know what you don't know. And in order to and it's also like the language, because you don't want to offend people, right? Like, you don't know this. You just have to learn the language to softly say, hey, I think this angle is wrong and the story you're trying to tell is not right. And I don't know if I don't think there are any editors here. Very recently I was commissioned on something and I wrote to the editor and said, it's just this angle is, I didn't use the soft, because the journalist had pitched the story. and he had forwarded me the exact pitch. And I basically, in a little more polite way, went back and I said, this is bullshit. This doesn't even happen. This is a very twisted, skewed angle. And the editor just copy and pasted my email to the journalist, which was very bad, because then she, like, the whole time she had she had her guards up. Eventually down the road, a month after, like, going back and forth, I said, okay, whatever. She came to my point. She realized it's actually not what she was trying to tell.
And I want to go back to a point that you were making, which I think sort of touches upon this as well. When you as a photographer, when you're doing your work, no matter how sort of native you are in the environment, and you say also you speak one of the local languages, at least that gives you access, how important is the collaboration within the context itself with, you know, the people that help you, whether it's a stringer, as it's called, or somebody who's there also to just sort of help you maneuver also more of the sort of, yeah, things that even might be blind spots for you?
Oh, it's very, very, very important. I would argue none of the works, and no, I speak the language and I lived there for a long time, but none of these work was possible if I was working solo, if I didn't have local collaborators. And there are a lot of discussion about what's the right term, fixer, translator, I don't like any of those. I say my local colleagues, and we go into this like equally all the time. And there are a lot of discussion about who has the right to tell this story or who should be telling this story. In the context of Afghanistan today, I can say there are a lot of stories that a foreigner can tell and an Afghan can't, because if they do, they get prosecuted. They get sent to jail. But a foreigner is safe to do it. And then there's also a lot of stories that a foreigner doesn't know, like an Afghan knows exactly how it is. So it has to be hand in hand. It has to be, it goes together, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think that also, because I think what you see in the work, which is sort of very implicit, is that there's a sense of mindfulness, there's a sense of utter respect, there's a sense of sort of softness, incredible intimacy. I'm wondering, for everybody who sort of loves portrait photography, and you have some really masterful, amazing work in that sense, and landscapes, but specifically with portraits, you come into a room where people are generally not used to seeing big cameras, and they're not used to sort of, you're also a woman, they're not used to seeing perhaps a woman have a certain role like that. How do you maneuver, like, just the process of when do you when do you take out your camera, basically? Like, when do you decide this is going to be the right time to sort of, like, you know, snap?
So I always, except if we're worried about security, my camera is always on my shoulder, because I think it's important from the moment you walk into the room, the rules are established that I'm here to document something. But I also am not, I've lost scenes because I don't act fast, and it's okay with me. I take that at that cost, it's okay. I take my time. If I go to funerals, I make sure I go up to the people who are mourning and I introduce myself. I sit down with them, and if it's women, I put my hand on their knee. I do make a lot of body contact in the context, and I'm learning now. I'm like moving out of Afghanistan. I'm learning the certain habits that I built in Afghanistan doesn't work in every culture. But in Afghanistan, I make a lot of body contact. So I put my hand on their knee and I just sit with them. And then I was like, may I photograph? And then I step away and take photos. And sometimes you lose scenes, that's okay. In terms of portraits where I pose people, like I'm going in saying that I'm going to do your photo, and one other thing I do, I just, like today I was saying this, I was like, I thought it's so normal, but I guess not everyone knows it. When I'm shooting, I hunch. I actually like walk away from shoots like with a lot of backache, because I hunch, because I want to make myself small. If we're sitting in a room, if they're sitting on a chair, I make sure I sit on the floor, because I want to make myself as small as possible, and that always helps. And some of you guys, if you have interacted with me, I'm very loud and very energetic, and I try to like find the right balance between not overtaking the energy and in the room, but also like in terms of. In Afghanistan, you're dealing with a population that are not necessarily used to having cameras around them, or when you say turn your head, if you mean like gently, they go like this. So I've developed this little habit of, I use my hand, I put it in front of their, like with the distance out of face, is like, okay, follow my hand, and then hold on here, and several times repeat, Do not move. Now move your eyes. So I try to break it down into simple steps. And this slows down the process. And it helps a lot with the, what else do I do when I'm photographing? Yeah, and I mean, I can't help it. I'm Iranian, I'm Persian. I've got poetry running through my blood. So I think about symbolism a lot, right? In this photo series I did for the New York Times, it was very challenging because women are not allowed to go anywhere, so we're stuck inside homes. I am working in environments sometimes with like a few meters of space, and I have to make it work. There's no power, so I have to deal with it. So I just like slowly developed this concept is like, okay, this is about, okay, maybe sun setting, like hope disappearing, like, so I'm going to use this daylight, I'm going to use it when it's at an angle. I'm going to use a lot of windows, a lot of bars, because people are inside. So that was just developed with it.
Are you good at editing your own work?
I am shit at my editing. I am terrible.
Oh no.
I am terrible. I am very bad.
So does it happen that you go back once you've done a shoot and then you like find gold in the older work, let's say?
I don't, but editors have pulled stuff out of my work that I'm like, oh, I am very bad.
So if you were, because we were saying there's a lot of photographers and maybe not photographers, people interested in photography, what would you think constitutes a really good photographer? I mean, do you wish you had that ability to edit to sequence it, to edit it?
Of course, of course. It's I don't know. I wonder if I've got a very chaotic brain. Like sitting down for me is very hard. I'm very hyperactive, and I think part of not being able to edit my work is I can't sit down and look at photos for a long time. I think if I had that, maybe I was a better person, and what makes a good photographer? I mean, in our genre of work, you have to be a good listener, which also means listen to the stories people are trying to tell you, listen to the signs and signals and body languages, listen to feedback you get on the work, right? And I think core of it is have an understanding of why you're doing the work that you're doing, and be honest about it with yourself. I think that is also very important.
Yes. Are there any questions? I have a few other questions, but I'm just going to sort of... Okay. So, I mean, now we're also saying, we're here, we're completely in a different context where, Afghanistan sounds and feels really far away. Why do you think it's important to have that work also shown in a place like here, like Kran, that,
I think it's at the time when media giving no space to, this is an ongoing struggle. I mean, if you don't hear about this struggle, doesn't mean it has stopped. It's actually worse than ever before, in a different sense. War has come to an end, but, and I think it's important to show the work just to remind people that this is going on. And I love, we were talking about this with Fernanda the other day, that I love small festivals compared to like the Visa pour Clémage or all. It's so intimate, and sometimes you see the impact of the work that is shown on people much more immediate, and it's a very beautiful experience.
And on that note, do you feel that I mean, can you give us a sense of how, because I know that you go back and forth and you have contacts and you stay close to that context. What's your feel in terms of the situation today, that what we don't hear on the news?
Someone else had asked me, how do you describe the situation in Afghanistan? And I think what has changed is the struggle has always been there for years and years. And the struggle, it changed forms and shape. The struggle has been there. But one thing that has changed is before Taliban took over, no matter how bad the war was, no matter how much bloodshed existed, there was always a little bit of hope at the end. There was a bit of a light at the end of the tunnel, and that helps you to like go on, And both as an Afghan living in that society is like, I'm just going to work towards that, and as somebody who works there as a storyteller, is like, my stories can do something, so I'm just going to strive for that. That light is gone, which makes it very hard. Like for me, sometimes it's hard now to. Why am I telling these stories? Like, what's the point of it? What's the, what am I going to change? Nothing's going to change. And it's something, again, I was talking to Rachel about this, is I was on a National Geographic grant documenting something, and as I was documenting the lives of these young girls who were mostly teenager, early 20s, everything I was photographing would get banned within weeks or months, so I couldn't show those photos, otherwise I would have endangered the girls. And it reached a point where I started panicking. I was like filled with anxiety, like, what am I going to do? And I talked to my editor, who I really trust the way he thinks, Jamie Welford, and he said, you know what, just think about it as you're documenting the history, and it must exist. It may not be seen for years and years and decades, and that's okay, but it exists. That shifted how I look at the work that I produce in Afghanistan now. I don't see it as an immediate change. I don't see it as, okay, it's going to be published or it's going to be seen. It's like, this has to be documented, and there will be a time and a day and an age that it will have a value. If that does yeah.
I think it's I think it's a really, I think it's really important to think of it, because you know, you're in the thick of it, and I feel sometimes when you're there, you also sometimes do ask yourself the mundane questions of, why am I doing this? How is this even possible? I mean, just looking back at that video with you showing the publication, I think to any sort of Western gaze, or like a gaze that's sort of more familiar with, you know, the yellow frame, it would be like, oh wow, you know. But I also wonder, I mean, there's also something deeply ethically troubling about that. And it feels a little bit awkward even, like seeing it and thinking like, oh, I mean, you know, beautiful portrait that's on the cover. How does she feel? Does she feel used? Does she feel that, yes, especially because in being super cynical, saying it's not really going to make a difference, but actually somebody's really made a lot of money with that.
Thank you for saying that. There was a discussion, so just so you guys know, any photo that goes on the cover of Nat Geo, it has to have consent, written form. So when they decided they want to put this on the cover, they reached out to me and they said, we need to have Hafiza's consent. And it was a discussion I had with my editors, like, what does consent mean in this context? This woman is illiterate. This woman has never left. She has commuted between 2 villages all her life. She has no understanding of what a magazine is. And funny enough, in that little video, they say your photo is printed on a book. They don't even understand what a magazine is. And let alone what Nat Geo is and the impact of becoming an icon is. What does it mean? Anyway, we went ahead and got the concept. From what I understand, there has been one other case recently about, again, what is consent, and it has generated some discussion about this. Should I say the other thing too? I make sure, so it's I carry a lot of guilt because listen, we go to these places and we create these works, we make a name for ourselves, we fill our bank accounts, and I don't know how my conscience can be clean just like that. So, and this is something I talk about it publicly, and some of my editors know. It's very unethical to pay your subjects, like, because you don't want to turn this into a transaction that you do this, I do this, like it's like a back and forth. But many times where I do the stories and I know the access has come genuinely because they want to give me access, there's no expectation. I make sure, like if I'm going and I'm reporting on something like poverty, people are like dying from not having food. I make sure when I leave, like a day later or 2 days later, somebody show up to where they are and with like rice and flour. Like this is how I try to like compensate for it. And same with Hafiza. After everything was finished, the story, like everything was finished, I make sure that they are from a different channel. They were compensated, let me say.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, it's not, the question's not there to put you on the spot. I think it's a general sort of question of, there's a system that's simply defunct. There's a system that's been put in place, and it's sort of archaic when you think of it, and it hasn't really modernized itself. I think the notion of asking for consent with somebody who's, I mean, even if I think of, I work a lot in Eastern Europe, I've worked a lot in the Middle East and all that. It's not a notion. I mean, people just don't understand that it has a different sort of reasoning for them because it just has different weight, or it's just simply not part of that system.
The reason I talk about it, I think it's important to have that discussion, and there are healthy ways of kind of like, you can't fix a system like this, but there are ways to balance it, if that makes sense. And I think it's important to have this discussion.
And I think what's maybe then, as if I may then continue and say, I think it is incredibly important that you do that work, because you also bring a sense of a native touch where it's very difficult to get that. And I think it's always going to trump anybody else coming in there with a foreign eye or foreign gaze that might be an incredible photographer. So I'm personally very grateful that there's people like you that do the work that's being done on that level. And I wonder, because I know that there's a lot of people that have that sort of adrenaline kick, and partially there's a little bit of that, and partially there's a little bit of sort of genuine interest in being in a context. What would you recommend to anybody who might be interested to go work in a really difficult context? Any do's or don'ts? Like, how do you prepare for it? Like, do you at all prepare for it? Or what would you give any, wise ideas, wise thoughts to anybody wishing to do so?
I'm going to repeat something I said earlier. First thing first, come to terms why you want to tell that story and why you want to enter this. Even if it means like taking therapy sessions, like understand why you want to go cover this area. If it's a war, or if it's poverty, is it the glory of the photography? Then you're there for the wrong reason. If it's a story, why? Why this story? Why? And I think that helps to, so that's like the very, very basic, why you're going into that environment. And then it comes to like, talk to people who have covered that area for a long time, have an understanding, do your research. And I think I have a lot of issues with the term conflict photographer, war photographer. I think it's very, very wrong to parachute from one place to another.
Sorry, why? Why is that wrong?
I think it's a wrong term. It's the wrong reason to go from one conflict to another, and that should be your identity. That should be the label you're going to put on your identity. I find it wrong. Some people can have an argument against it. I think a lot of that title is like related to this like glorious identity that is associated with this, and I don't know if people are going into it for the right reason. Do you?
I wouldn't know. I mean, I know a few people who do call themselves war photographers, and I think that's simply because sometimes you need to put yourself into a bubble so that other people can understand what you do versus really identifying that way. So I think it's also a marketing thing. I don't know if there's really a rule. I think some people take it more personal. Other people are slightly more absolved of that whole idea. So I want to sort of turn around and ask if there's any last questions, because I think we need to wrap up. I know we started a little bit later, but I hope we're not too much over time.
If you have a good question, you get a hug from me afterwards.
Oh, look at that. Or a massage. She gives great massage.
This is getting
Yes. Hang on. Oh, thank you.
Hi.
Hello.
Inspiring talk, thank you. So I want to ask you, your book, When Cages Fly, so it originated as a commission for the New York Times Magazine, but then you also made your author photo book about it. So I want to ask you, how do you feel, what are the differences doing photography for an editorial story in a magazine and then expressing yourself in the form of a photo book?
It's actually a very good question. So when I did the story, I never thought about a book. It was only like when I connected the dots, it's like, oh, this is very cool concept and cool experience. We had a whole discussion today. It's like, what is a book? What is a photo book? It was very liberating. It was so exciting to be able to look at my own photos, not only the present, but also we went through my archive to pull photos for the before and after chapter, to be able to be playful, to be lyrical, to be poetic, this is not a piece of journalism, this is an experience. So I was able to crop photos and zoom, and I did this like as part of the design element. There are certain photos that it's 1/3, 2/3, and the next page they flip, and there are also photos that are not like that, but it looks like it is. It's like, and be playful. Loved it. And now I'm like, for the past 6 months, I've been working on another very serious project about human rights and like very serious projects, but I cannot wait to like get through the first like chapter, like get it published, etc. But then be playful and turn it into a book and have fun with it. The first book was a bit challenging because it was a lot of learning, so sometimes the fun would like disappear. But I can't wait. Now that I know those things, I want to have fun, and I edit and I want to be playful with it. Does that
Thank you.
answer your question?
Can the last question, and then I swear. And the last question is actually looking towards the future. Can you tell us something about what you have in store? What are you planning? What are some exciting things that we can look forward to? Thank you.
Ready for some dark stuff? So I finished this one big project. I think the next few months I will be busy getting the work out there. I'm also developing this bigger project about education under attack around the world. But I am very lost. Yeah, and I openly talk about it. I am very I'm struggling to have motivation, and I usually the way I work, I have all these like commissions and stories, but I always have this like bigger thing that I'm super interested about, and I just don't have that, and nothing clicks, and I don't know. It's the other day I was telling Cyril, it's like kind of like a creativity drought. It just nothing excites me. So yes, I have things lined up for the next year, but after that, I'm struggling. Might be also like the climate we're living in, generally with news and media and everything, and I really hope that changes. I might be burnt out, I don't know. But yeah, so that's that.
Well, thank you very much for the honesty, and I think on behalf of everybody, good luck, because
Thank
I
you.
think you're doing amazing work and really valuable work. And I also want to thank you for the presentation, having prepared this so meticulously, and for the openness, and also thank you to Kraň for having us and allowing us to sort of experiment with our thoughts on what we thought about photography. Thank you, everyone.
And I
for
hope you
listening.
guys didn't get bored.